Okay, hi, I'm Allison Caruth, the conference organizer, and it's great to see you all this morning. We have an action-packed day, and among keynotes and panel sessions, we also have the food fair and conference exhibition hall happening down on the first floor. We have over 20 marvelous nonprofit organizations, farms, media groups here today to interact with you and tell you about the work they're doing. So I hope you take advantage of that throughout the day. Food and art exhibition is also continuing at the Laverne Krause Gallery in Lawrence. We're much closer to Lawrence Hall today. It's just out the main doors of the EMU to your right, and you can ask any student to direct you to Lawrence Hall, the art building. So that will be going on throughout the day. So welcome back to Food Justice. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first keynote session that features Darra Goldstein, who I'm honored that she's here, but I'm going to leave the introduction of her to Amy Tigner, the moderator of our session this morning on Gastronomica and the journal's 10-year history, as well as the sort of wider context in which Darra Goldstein and Amy Tigner are going to situate that history. Amy Tigner is an assistant professor of English at the University of Texas at Arlington, and her book, England's Paradise, is forthcoming from Ashgate Press. She's an expert on Renaissance drama and culture and has a particular focus on gardening, horticulture, and food in that period. She and I are also collaborating right now on a book that is going to offer a long history of food, culture, and literature from about 1492 to 2011. So it's my honor to introduce Amy Tigner.
Thank you, Allison. And it's my great honor to introduce Darra Goldstein. She is the Francis Christopher Oakley 3rd Century Professor of Russian at Williams College. And she's an expert in Russian literature, art, and food. She has several books, and I'm only mentioning a few that she's written and edited. A Taste of Russia, The Georgian Feast, The Vibrant Culture and Savory Food of the Republic of Georgia, Culinary Cultures of Europe, Identity, Diversity, and Dialogue. She's the editor of that collection, and also the editor of Feeding Desire, Design, and Tools of the Table. But she's here today because she's also the editor of the really beautiful and also important food journal, Gastronomica. So please welcome Darra Goldstein.
Thank you.
So I think our venue today is going to be, I'm going to ask some questions first for about 30 or 40 minutes. And then I'm hoping that we'll also engender questions that you have, and we will then open it up for about 20, 25 minutes for your questions at the end. Okay?
So, let us begin.
Let's begin. So Allison mentioned that Gastronomica has been around for 10 years, so this is the 10th year anniversary. And I'd like to begin by asking you if you could talk about your inception of the journal and how you conceived of the idea, what you wanted to accomplish, and how you went about making a journal into a reality.
It still doesn't seem like a reality. That's my short answer to it. But I think the inception probably started many, many years ago before I was even aware of it. When I entered graduate school, I wanted to write my dissertation on food and Russian literature. This was many years ago, and I was laughed down the corridors by my professors and told I was a very unserious person. So I think that my subsequent life since then has been trying to prove them wrong. But really what made the journal happen was in the mid-1990s, I had been publishing very actively as a Slavic scholar. My field of specialization is Russian modernist poetry. And I had also been writing cookbooks and food articles in the other part of my life, and the two were very separate, and it just didn't feel right. The Soviet Union collapsed. It gave me an opportunity to really think about where I was heading. And I also happened to have written, I think, one of the best articles I've ever done, which was looking at the great 19th century French chef Carême, who had gone to St. Petersburg, decided that the city was not at all sufficiently monumental for the capital of an empire. And he did these beautiful drawings for monuments for St. Petersburg. And I compared those with the pièces montées that he made for the table. These were centerpieces made out of marzipan or pastry, and they were in all kinds of beautiful architectural forms. And I thought, wow, here's something that brings all of my interests together, and I finally found a way to express myself. And the journal was first, the article was first rejected, but then it was accepted by the Slavonic and East European Review, which comes out of the University of London, and probably 50 people, if I'm lucky, read it. And they weren't really the people who wanted to learn about Carême and his pièces montées and the table settings of the early 19th century. And I thought something is wrong here. There are other people like me who don't know that I've written this, I don't know what they're writing. It was also a time when we were starting to talk about food studies. And I felt very strongly that there needed to be a journal where we could create a dialogue. People could know about other people in the field, discover findings, respond to them. So I had a sabbatical in, I think it was 1999. I thought, so I'll create a journal. And that's how it happened, and I had no idea what I was doing.
Can you talk about this is an off-the-cuff question, sorry, but can you talk about the first issue and how you got it together? Starting a journal is really difficult.
Oh, it was totally anxiety-producing. First, I went to the University of California Press, with whom I already had a relationship, a book under contract I still haven't finished, I might add, because I've been working on Gastronomica. But I wanted to publish with a university press, again, because I wanted to create a journal that would somehow shape food studies, and I felt if I went to a trade publisher, it wouldn't have the academic creds that it needed. And UC Press agreed to publish it, so then what do you do? I decided it should be quarterly because that was the only way I could handle it in my life. And I also wanted it to be a sort of, I really love all the food magazines. I contribute to them. I love to savor the recipes and think about the travel. But they're really about lifestyle. And I wanted something that looked very seriously at food. At the dark side of food, at burning issues surrounding food. But I also didn't want to give up on the pleasure component, because for me, that's a huge part of what it is. And I wanted it to be beautiful. I didn't want to look like a standard academic journal that it just seems like it's been word processed and you have some grainy black and white photographs and you say, wow, I got art in my article. I really wanted it to be lush. So, but how to do this? Well, first I started looking for a cover image, and I found what I thought was the quintessential one, a still from Buñuel's film L'Âge d'Or, with Leah Lee sucking her lover's hand. And to me it epitomized everything, because there was sort of ingestion. I mean, she wasn't swallowing it, but she was putting it into her mouth. It was pleasure. It was food of love, I guess you could say. And it was high culture, because of course it was Buñuel. So after I had the cover, because I was always starting with the visual, then I was thinking, well, I need some scholarly articles. I also want poetry, I want prose, and basically I got in touch with all my friends, acquaintances, people I admired, and said, please, please, will you write for nothing, basically, and help me start this magazine. And I think in 10 years, only 2 or 3 people have ever said no. So that's been really wonderful.
Can you talk, you've sort of started to talk about the fact that you have both an academic and a non-academic audience in mind. And what I'd like you to think about is how you balance those two, both in terms of the way that you shape the journal, but also then talk about how what your perception of its reception, both by an academic and a non-academic audience.
It's really interesting to have a decade. You know, I like these really neat points where you can stop and say, oh, it's been 10 years, and now I can look back and assess things. So in the beginning, I was completely anxious. I'm only slightly anxious now, I guess you could say. Then I was completely anxious. You know, I have to prove myself. I have to prove that food studies is serious. And so it needed to be a very serious journal. Now I often call it a magazine. You know, I've lightened up considerably. But I remember the reviews of that first issue, and it was very well received, but many of the reviewers said there are so many footnotes. You know, they were shocked that there would be so many footnotes. But as I mentioned, I didn't want it to be stolid. It's very important to me that the writing always be engaging. So one of the first rules was, even if you're writing a highly scholarly article within your discipline, it cannot be jargon-ridden. It has to be accessible to people who know nothing about the field and bring them in. In fact, most readers of Gastronomica are not academics. There was a demographic study that UC Press did some years ago, and I think it was only 35 to 40% academics who were reading it, and mostly it was sort of regular folks who had an interest in food and in art. I think it's become less stolid over the years. I allow myself to have more fun with it, more lighthearted articles, but it still has this scholarly core at the center.
So this leads me to the next question, which you started to answer, but how do you see the journal has really changed in 10 years?
Well, I think the main way is that it is taking more chances. I'm accepting articles that I wouldn't have accepted at the beginning. One example that I can give, it is probably the most personally disturbing article I ever published, by an artist who calls herself Chrissy Caviar. And she is an activist artist, and basically what she did was found a doctor who would harvest her own eggs, and she packaged them in caviar jars and made an installation, and they were ostensibly for sale. In fact, there was a chef in Korea who wanted to buy them and serve them, and at that point she said no. You know, even I have my limits. But what she was doing was looking at women's bodies as commodities. She was looking at packaging. She was looking at desire and luxury. And it was a really important article, even though it was enormously distressing. And I think that in the first couple of years, I would not have been bold enough to do it.
What do you see in the next 10 years?
Well, it's hard to know. I think right now, Gastronomica as such is a really beautiful journal. How many of you have seen it or cradled it in your arms? Okay, it's a nice thing to cradle. I think there are a few copies out. Oh, they're downstairs in there's a media table, and you can look at it and see what it looks like. When Gastronomica started, the web was not what it is today. And I feel like, in a certain way, Gastronomica is now a grandmother. You know, I know it is just moving into its adolescence, but it doesn't have an active web presence. One of the things I was trying to do last summer is with each story, or some of the stories that were published in the magazine, I wanted to have a backstory that was available on the web. So that, for instance, there was a really lovely article about Gordon Maddock Clark and his involvement with the restaurant food in the early 1970s in New York. And so I had a student of mine who was interested in his work, and she went and found a man who's still alive, who was involved in the restaurant, and she did an interview with him, and we put it up. And she did interviews with some of the chefs. we've featured in Gastronomica, and it seems to me that every story has a backstory, or there are more images that you can bring to it, and I would love for it to become more visible in a digital way.
I want to turn now to think about Gastronomica and its very interdisciplinary focus. Because if you haven't read it, it has poetry, it has artwork, it has, as she said, scholarly articles and personal memoirs. It's quite a cornucopia of work. And I'd like you to muse a bit about how you think Gastronomica is in some way in conversation with some of the topics that we've been discussing over the last couple of days about food justice.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question, because I think just in the past year or even 9 months, one of the ways that I'm learning so much from editing Gastronomica is I see the kinds of submissions that come in, and that tells me what the zeitgeist is out there, what people are thinking about. And I have had a real glut of articles that have to do with issues of sustainability, with issues of organics. In the May issue, there will be an article on the politics of organic farming, looking at red states, blue states, and where organic farms are. In the August issue, there will be one on a community farm in San Francisco that has engaged a lot of people who otherwise would not be having access to good food. So I feel that it's not even so much me. We did one article on food politics, one issue, I mean, that was entirely devoted to that in 2007. And that was a conscious editorial decision. But a lot of it depends on what people send me. And Patricia Allen, who's right over there, I met her at the first conference like this that Allison had organized in Santa Barbara, and was just so amazed by what she was doing. And I asked her to do a piece that ended up being called The Disappearance of Hunger in America. And it's one of the ones I really like to point people to, because it was very well written. It was concise, but it went right to the heart of the matter of the change in language that seems so benign. They stopped, the USDA stops talking about hunger and calls it food insecurity. And so once you lose that really human emotional element, somehow it's easier to deal with, because it's an abstraction. It's a thing that we have to deal with. So I am hoping that out of this conference, maybe some more things will come.
Also, in each issue, we get to read Darra's short editorial in the beginning. And I would love to have you talk a little bit about where you get your inspirations, and if you have any particular one that you want to discuss, that would be also lovely.
She asks where I get my inspiration, then you see me the night before the letters due. It's like, oh no, I have nothing to say. I've been saying something 4 times a year for 10 years, No, it's, again, looking back, I would say that many of the letters mirror my own concerns at a given point in time. For instance, when my daughter started elementary school, I was somehow, I guess I was really naive, but I was horrified to find that they only had 20 minutes to eat. And that 20 minutes was just before recess. So of course no one was taking 20 minutes because they wanted to get outside and play. And I tried to get involved with the school system and say, you're instilling bad eating habits in our kids. And so that felt like a really burning issue to me. That was obviously, I guess it was towards the very beginning of Gastronomica. Last year, my mother was in a nursing home, and it was sort of the beginning point of life and then the end point of life, and seeing that there too, there are huge problems institutionally with the way we treat our older people at a time in their lives when they're completely vulnerable. and maybe don't have very long to live. They're not given food that tastes good. The pleasure is taken away. It's all, oh, you shouldn't have too much salt, you shouldn't have too much sugar, even though you might die, in 2 weeks. We're going to make sure that, it's nutritionally sound. And I meditated on that and the state of institutionalized eating. Last summer, we took a trip through the Central Valley in California and ended up in Delano, where the farm worker movement really began in the 60s, and then also visited the Cesar Chavez Center. And so I was thinking about the farm migrant workers, the labor movement, how Cesar Chavez has this extraordinary center that I urge all of you to go to. They have a beautiful gallery with photographs now. He's buried in a rose garden, and it's all really moving. But what about the Filipino workers? There's sort of nothing there for them. So it's really many things that just happen in my life.
Last night we were talking about how you think of the journal as really almost your personality in a
For
kind
better
of
or worse.
yeah. Well, in the sense that you really think about editing as shaping something. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you balance aesthetic and more political issues in the journals. I mean, I realize that some of it is, as you said, what you get you're sort of limited by that, but at the same time you have a choice, and you also choose a wonderful cover every time.
Yeah, the cover's the most fun. That's the best part. You don't have to edit it. Maybe there's a little photoshopping that needs to happen, but mostly it is what it is, and there isn't a lot of wrangling. Well, to me, everything is kind of political. And in a way, everything is kind of aesthetic. So I don't really see those two as opposite poles. But I would try for each issue not to have too many articles that seem to be in the social sciences realm to the exclusion of something that was more humanistic. And so I try to have a balance of longer and shorter articles, make sure that there are really vivid images in every one, a poem in every one, a work of art that is discussed in every one. So,
how much do you have to sort of go out and search for things now? I mean, you talked about that in your first issue where you really had to go out and search. And how much now is really just because the journal has a kind of cachet that you just get lots of submissions?
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed with submissions now, I would say. What I still do is troll the web and go to a lot of art galleries and exhibitions because I'm interested in finding new art. But in terms of the articles, it's mostly people sending queries or articles to me. And wonderful things I never would have thought about. I mean, it is such a joy to be able to enter into something entirely new. It is always teaching me things.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, and I just want to ask you, what do you see are the global concerns in food studies at the present moment?
That is a big question.
I know, so you can just answer it any way you like.
Well, I think there's a lot of, obviously, the issue of feeding people, food prices, making sure that there's access to food for everyone, everywhere, is really pressing. It's tied up with water and the depletion of water sources, all of the things that we've been talking about at this conference. So that's one really big one. Another one is just food networks, food systems, and the whole tension or dynamic, depending how you want to think about it, between the local and the larger world, and what is our responsibility not just to our neighbors and our community, but because we are part of this planet, to farmers in other parts of the world who rely on us as consumers. So it's not just a question of how far the food has to travel, but also the livelihoods of people elsewhere who depend on us. We can talk about issues of nutrition and the malnutrition, either from a lack of food or from too much food that isn't healthy. But those are all sort of the negative things in a way. The positive would be and I see this at this conference, which is so wonderful, the reinvigoration of American and European youth, and an interest in farming, and interest in working the soil, and recognizing that you don't have to go to law school or business school to be a good, successful person. There are other ways to live your life, and I think that's fabulous.
I'm reminded, Darra came to a conference in Texas in October, and she showed us some wonderful images. And one of the images was of the tomato eater.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
I think it fits into what you're talking about, globalization. It's this, you described him as sort of swarthy-looking man. You see a mustache and a hand, and this very, very ripe tomato, and he's sort of eating the tomato. Could you talk about the controversy that image
Yes, this
engendered?
was just, to me, the craziest, most unexpected thing, and I should have thought to broadcast it here. I was in Berkeley, and I met this woman named Gail Scoff, who's a wonderful photographer. And she takes, at that point, she'd been taking photographs of vegetables, often of misshapen vegetables, just because they were beautiful. And I said, well, let me see what else you have. And I was in her studio looking through things, and I saw this amazing photograph, as Amy said, as a swarthy man with a bristly mustache and very dirty hands that had been the soil. And he had a ripe, just a lush, bright red tomato that he was putting into his mouth. And the membranes in the tomato were all visible, and it was ecstasy. And I said, I want that for the cover of Gastronomica. I'm going to run it in November, you know, when in New England there's nothing red, there's nothing ripe. You know, we can dream of summer, and I was so excited. And I started getting, this was before emails were as prevalent as they are today. I started getting phone calls, one from a cookbook store in Los Angeles, of all places. We're not carrying Gastronomica anymore. This cover is too upsetting. And other people called. I said, what's upsetting? People don't like to look at it, but I needed to find out what it was. And finally she said, it looks like meat. I said, well, okay, but you know, what's wrong with meat? Well, maybe if you're vegetarian, you don't want to be confronted with meat, but I still didn't really understand the meat part. I think what it was is that, well, first of all, it was just after 9/11. This was a North African migrant worker. He was dark. There were all kinds of issues of, you know, sort of the other of migrant workers. He had dirty hands. They were close to his mouth. So for all of the rhetoric about, you know, we want our vegetables fresh, we don't want them wrapped, you know, in plastic, we want them real. When people were confronted with the reality of a real tomato being enjoyed by someone whose hand had been the dirt and who looks a little different from us, and it maybe seemed eroticized, it was too much for them. So that was that cover.
Could you describe your work that you did with the Council of Europe?
Oh, the work that I did with the Council of Europe was really, really wonderful for me, and it all grew out of my work with Gastronomica. I was asked to be part of a small international team looking for ways the food could be used to promote tolerance and diversity. So there was a British sociologist, Stephen Mennell, who wrote, what is the title of his book? It just escaped me, The Something of Food. It's a really wonderful book. Arya Nadler, who does peace and reconciliation studies at Tel Aviv University, a Frenchman who does tourism studies, and there were a few other people. And we brainstormed to try and find ways for all of the 50 nations who are part of the Council of Europe to begin talking to each other instead of saying, you know, we don't like you because you do things this way, or you're stealing our cheese because this cheese has been made in our village for eons and now you're marketing it. And there are a lot of tensions. So if food could be used to bring people together, that would be wonderful. And what came out of that was a volume published for the 50th anniversary of the signing of the European Cultural Convention, in which I think 36 of those countries wrote statements about themselves and who they are, national identity through food. And it was really fascinating because some of them were very, very sophisticated. And others were, I think of the Ukrainian one, which was written by the tourism office, and the photograph they gave us was of all these beautiful Ukrainian women, buxom Ukrainian women in the field with the sheaves of wheat. You know, it was all fecundity and just, there wasn't as much content, but that in itself was interesting because it just showed the way different nations were thinking about themselves. But even the publication of that volume created some discord because Armenia and Azerbaijan, who were having political clashes, Azerbaijan was very upset that Armenia had 2 more pages than it did. And it turned, you know, the highest levels of government got involved. So it was an eye-opener. In a way, I think it showed that you can begin to create tolerance through commensality, but obviously there are other issues that need to be addressed before it really happens.
So along with sort of at least the idea of getting some good out of food, could you also talk about the kind of negative side? For example, the McDonaldization of society and how you see that, particularly in Russia.
You know, it's funny when people ask me about this, I feel like I'm suddenly cast in the role of the devil because McDonald's in Russia was not a bad thing. I mean, it was actually kind of a wonderful thing. So you have to try and picture 70 odd years of Soviet rule where there was not much food to eat. What you had was not of good quality, unless of course you had, you know, special people had access to special foods. But for the bulk of the population, it was very grim. You would go into a place, they might not have anything. Even if they did have something, they would scream at you. It was not a culture in which eating out was a pleasant experience. In 1990, I think it was, McDonald's came to Moscow. Very, very symbolically built the golden arches right across from the Kremlin, you know, so it's us and it's them. But the thing was, it was a bright, clean, well-lit place. Whether the food was good or bad, it was consistent. It was always up to a certain quality. It was meat, which for the Russians was something really wonderful. And I think the most important thing was that you went there and, you know, it might drive you crazy here, but everyone is always smiling, you know. Hi, how are you? Have a nice day. Here's your Happy Meal. You know, that whole smiliness around McDonald's, which we can see as insidious, was actually a beautiful thing there. And it spawned homespun, like Russian Bistro and a bunch of other fast food places that started to think about the culture of service. That was one good thing. The other was because everyone was so excited to try McDonald's, they couldn't keep up with the demand, and so they had to create local farms to grow lettuce, to grow tomatoes, and so on an entrepreneurial level, they created local businesses and local farms, which I think is a good thing. So I'm no fan of McDonald's, but I don't think that it is unequivocally bad.
Was it affordable for most Russians?
No, it wasn't, but it was the kind of thing you would save up for to have the experience. And people would come from, thousands of miles away to that first one and get the hamburger in the box and take it back to Siberia or wherever. But it was a phenomenon, and also the packaging was wonderful. And you never got, if you went to the market or something, it was put in old newspapers. Just the packaging itself was cheerful. So it is interesting to contemplate McDonald's in Russia.
Well, on that note, I think I'd like to open it to the audience. If you want to step up there are microphones on either side, and then we'll just take in order of anyone who wants to ask a question. Brave soul.
Sorry. Thanks. This is a continuation question with the whole Russian thing. It just occurred to me when you said that your background in Russian studies may have colored the journal, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. So, how your
the dark side of things.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. So, yeah, could you let us know a little bit about that?
Okay, that's an interesting comment. I haven't really thought that through. I think that perhaps I am drawn to cold and dark and not Tuscan sun, sort of the antithesis of what most people who are in the food world want to celebrate. So maybe that, I don't know if it's the Russian or just my personality, but there is that undercurrent. But I think probably more to the point, it's one of the other things I didn't mention that is enormously important for me in Gastronomica is to make sure that it's not an American journal of food and culture. There are more Americans who contribute. There are more Americans than other nationalities maybe, but there are a lot of international contributors now, particularly from Asia, Australia, Europe, Japan. It's really thrilling to me, and I want to make sure that I keep thinking about other places in the world and not just my own relative backyard. And whenever I can, I sneak in an article about Russia. There's a wonderful one, an essay called The Pros and Cons of Vodka. Pros, P-R-O-S-E, so the lyrical experience of vodka.
Yeah, good morning.
Hi.
I had two topics I was hoping you would be able to speak to. And the first is about the Western cultures or Americans' relation to food as compared to older cultures, even European, and what you see as the benefits of one or the other, and if there are differences, what the benefits are. And the second one would be about well, I'll wait for your response first.
So the first, if you think about how America was settled, for the most part, it was people coming here for refuge or because life was so difficult in the old country that they wanted to create a better life for themselves. America, from the beginning, how much of this is actual and how much has been mythologized needs to be further studied, but I know in accounts of colonial New England, the salmon just jumping, leaping out of the rivers. I'm sure they were in Oregon too when Lewis and Clark came, or the lobster, people wouldn't eat it because it was poor man's food, it was too abundant. So America from the very beginning was configured as a land of abundance. But at the same time, the dominant culture, the dominant European culture that came here was very puritanical in bent. And the idea of indulging and allowing yourself to take pleasure in food instead of just having food for sustenance, I think is still a real issue in American culture. And I honestly think that has contributed to a lot of the eating America's overall eating disorder, because, we crave things, but we feel guilty. We're not supposed to have them, so then it becomes somehow surreptitious. And instead of being allowed to really celebrate a meal, sit down and savor it, have the family time where the meal is almost a sacred moment, it's all dispersed, it's on the run, because we are a much more mobile society. So if you're not stopping to break bread with others and share and slow down and think about what it means to be the recipient of the bounty of the land, then food loses its meaning. When it loses its meaning, it's just, something else that you ingest, and we become careless about it. And I think that in Europe, obviously, people are not having long Sunday lunches every day of the week like they used to. People are also on the go, but there is still a much more rooted sense of the family meal.
And the second topic I was hoping you would address was about your journal, and I went online and I noticed that it's available online for just like large institutions or companies, but for the individual in the hard copy form. And I was wondering what your opinion was on the benefits or value of having something in a hard copy form versus solely in an electronic format.
Yeah, well, I think Gastronomica needs to exist in hard copy. It's a gorgeous journal. If you see it online, it just, I don't know, it's flat on the screen. You don't get the lush texture of the images. That said, I wish that more of the Gastronomica articles were available online for casual viewers. If any of you have access to a university library or another library that has JSTOR, you can see all of Gastronomica through JSTOR now. For those who can't, it's something I'm trying to discuss with UC Press to make more of the articles available. But I don't want it to go away as a hard copy journal.
Good morning. For those of us in the audience who are interested in producing sort of the content, do you have any advice for publishing in Gastronomica or for submissions or queries?
One of the things that I like to think Gastronomica has done is brought a lot of new voices to food writing. It really thrills me to publish people for the first time and help them launch their careers. So I'm very open to queries from people who are unknowns, shall I say. So you don't have to have a huge resume. If you are an unknown, however, it's really good to send me something completed so that I can see what the writing's like instead of just a query. If you have some clips of work that you've done and you want to send a detailed query, then that's another way to do it. But it shouldn't be, oh, I have this idea to write about a particular Bosque pear that is grown by a certain farmer in Oregon. It really needs to basically tell most of the story so I understand what is interesting about it. But yeah, queries are always welcome.
Hello, my name is Igbavado, and I'm with Village Garden Group. One thing that stand out to me this morning from your conversation was the fact that the picture that someone sent you or you viewed, which was the man eating a tomato, tasting his own food that he have grown and stuff, and the picture went out and people give you a comment back to the telling you the fact that they don't like it or it was disturbing and stuff. One thing that I want to leave for the audience, this morning is that one thing that's really playing a big role in our food system is the fact that we're not being able to accept each other. You know, I mean, the fact that we're not being able to accept each other, you know, for culture, as people and as those who are just producing the food. I feel like if we as people start to work a little more on accepting each other, I think that, you know, that our food system could, you know, will change along with who we are and the change that we are trying to, you know, we are trying to bring by accepting each other.
I think that was very beautifully stated. And I couldn't agree more.
My name was Songolo. I'm also with Village Garden. We came from North Portland. You had a beautiful presentation, and that metaphor showed me that there is something have to be done. And this room is planted with people who can do something. You conciliated your idea with food justice. And you said, you was clearly that there is an issue of feeding people. At the same time, there's also access to food for everyone. Those aspects are connected. If those aspects are connected, in myself, I feel inside we need hospitality. That hospitality will make us to be more others. More others, I say, more others 3 times. That means is eating in the morning, lunch, and evening. If that is the aspect we have to consider ourselves, what do you think? What do you think that the message everyone from this room can have like one sentence to come back to his community, or a student who are in this school after his training is having here, when he grow, because I know there is one story, I think, Jeanne d'Arc from France, who has covered what he made after 50 years. After 50 years. Those students are here, people from the community want to go back in the community and having something, a luggage, what they'll give to the community. What do you think that can be a luggage for people are here? Thank you.
Oh, so it all rests on me. Well, as I'm trying to think of the perfect thing to say, I will connect to Jennifer's question at the beginning about how my work in Russian studies has informed Gastronomica. And one of the things that struck me so much when I was starting to study the language is the Russian word for hospitality, which is хлебосольство. And what it actually means is bread and saltness. So these are the 2 things that are at the root of hospitality. Bread, which is, you know, kind of staff of life. Salt, which is, or was extremely expensive then, and showing great respect to anyone who came into your house. You prepared a beautiful loaf of bread, had a little indentation where you'd put a salt cellar, and you say, you are my guest, and I welcome you. So I don't know that I can come up with a perfectly pithy statement to send you all away with, but I think that what all of the conversations have been about, really, what it comes down to is being aware of others, trying to understand ourselves sort of antithetically to the American individualistic mode, you know, like it's about me, and that sort of narcissistic way of seeing things, to try and think in terms of community. And whether it's just 1 or 2 people, that also is a community, but from that it can become larger. And as soon as you start thinking in those ways, it begins to spread, and then it can actually turn into something that has profound meaning and a profound impact. So I guess that's what I would say.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I want to talk a little bit about, or just discuss a little bit about one of the things you said early in your talk about high culture, that you were glad that, you know, you wanted to have things that had high culture. And being from the low culture myself, you know, as a farmer who works in the dirt every day, I will go into the grocery store with, you know, my clothes, big mud on my knees and, you know, dirt up my arms. And I know people look at you and they look at, who's that filthy woman coming into my store? You know, but but I work for a restaurant. I grow food for a restaurant that is very high culture. So how do we bridge that gap of the fact that it's really the low culture that is making the high culture possible?
Oh, absolutely. And when I was talking about that first cover, you know, it was me wanting to position this new journal so that it would give academic credibility to food studies. So I was thinking very much in terms of academia. And if you are in the world of academia, then there are certain things that you have to do to play the game. And so you find a Buñuel image because people will respond to that and say, oh, well, this is smart, let me look inside. And then inside you might find an article about the farmers, but it is giving them a cue and trying to get people to think more broadly. I would say that as in life, as in art, you know, there isn't really a divide between high and low culture. That's just, again, an academic construct. To me, what's happening now is the so-called low culture of the dirt is becoming the high culture. I mean, the people who are working the soil, they're not simply workers, they're artists, really. I mean, you have to take the soil where we live, it's clay, you know, to turn that soil into some beautiful, beautiful loam, you really have to know how to work in like a magician. And then you grow beautiful vegetables, or maybe not so beautiful, but it's art.
So then how do you feel that your magazine, your journal, can help to inform the people of high culture, that the people of, I do some workshops from now on farming and gardening, and I've brought people who are of high culture out there, and I have to inform them that, you know, it'd be really best if you took off your gold rings and the diamonds because they will get dirty, and well, how do you get them to care about those people that are providing them with the essence of what is right. High culture?
Well, I have to say that, you know, there are some people who will never be convinced, and there's nothing I can do about that. But the way I can help is by having articles, and there are many, if you go back through the issues of Gastronomica, that celebrate farmers, farming, young people who are trying to do something different. And so it's right there. Some are photo spreads, people who are working the land or working as fishermen, or just beautiful photographs of vegetables themselves and contemplating where did these vegetables come from. So it is an opportunity to show people those who are laboring.
So do you think we're on an upward curve?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's anyone. Oh, here in the back.
Morning, thanks for being here. I have a question because I have a concern for public school children. And I'm wondering how you would characterize their understanding of food security, and also how Gastronomica starts to articulate a higher level of understanding for youth in K through 12 educational environments.
Mm-hmm. Boy, it's such a difficult question in the United States. When you're talking about food insecurity, you're talking about school populations who don't have access to good food. What I would urge all of you to do is read Jan Poppendink's book on school no free lunch, I think it's called. Free for All. Okay, thanks, Kate. Free for All, which is about school lunch in America. And I think that really will give you a wonderful sense of the problems with K through 12 education and access to good food. Gastronomica has periodically had articles relating to that, but it's not the focus of the journal. And I think that for the most part, it's not the K through 12 teachers who are reading Gastronomica. So I don't think that it's influencing that in any particular way. Although, you know, if you have an article to write, I would certainly be glad to consider it.
Okay, well I just feel that the food literacy is not one that is articulated in the educational enterprise today.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things is it's slow food, which I'm sure just about everyone here is familiar with. For many years was criticized for being too elitist. It was people who were looking at the most exquisite kind of artisanal production in a small area in a certain part of the world and celebrating that and getting together and feeling good about trying to preserve it. And it was doing good, but it was also sort of marginalizing it. But Josh Viertel, who just became the new director of Slow Food a year ago, has decided to take it in a different direction, which has upset a lot of Slow Food members, I must say. But he is becoming an activist. His thing is school lunches. And he's going to Washington, he's lobbying. And so the whole idea of slow food, which started out in a kind of rarefied way, is now trickling down into children's lives and policy decisions. So I think you should go to the Slow Food website and see what they're working on.
Thank you.
With that, I think we'll end this session, and I'd like to thank Darra Goldstein and have you give her some applause for this wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you both for this session. I just want everyone to know that our keynote roundtable is in this room, of course. And if you're having any trouble navigating the maze-like structure of the Herb Memorial Union, look for folks with a staff or volunteer badge on. They'll direct you in the afternoon after lunch to the concurrent panel session rooms. The Gumwood room is just behind this partition. The Fur room and Ben Linder room are downstairs. So just ask for directions. And if anyone needs a copy of the program, we have 6-foot-tall banners downstairs and up here as well with today's program listed in detail. So thank you for being here.